time now for our panel talking all about Bitcoin. Of course, the halving happened on Friday night, just after 8 p.m. Eastern time. And we've seen Bitcoin around 63, 66, so it didn't take off, somewhat priced in, but a lot of excitement, a lot of volume, and a lot to discuss here. Andy Baehr is with us, head of product CoinDesk Indices, and Ben Weiss, CEO of CoinFlip. Thank you both for being here. So I will start with you, Andy. I think that everybody I was speaking to about Bitcoin, they were excited for the halving because that can sometimes be a catalyst. And just like pot day, I have had guests on that say people buy more pot on that day. This was the Bitcoin day, sort of, right?
It sure was. And, those of us who came from traditional finance think that unless something is news or a surprise, it kind of has to be priced in, and there was no new information about Bitcoin after than before. The halving was predictable from the very first block back in 2009. That being said, when an entire community rallies around an event like this, you can't really ignore it. So whereas it may not change the valuation of Bitcoin, it can certainly change the flows. Historically, the Bitcoin price has rallied a couple of months after. The last halving, that came right as the COVID money was hitting the economy, so maybe that had something to do with it too, but the halving went off smoothly,
right.
And we take it from here.
Right, and it's generally every 4 years, but it's based on the units or the metrics, not really the 4-year mark. It's more about how much has been mined.
Precisely.
That being said, Ben, some of your thoughts, because now what? Where does crypto go next? What are some of the things people are talking about now on Monday that they have the news?
Well, it's an incredibly exciting time for Bitcoin and for crypto. And as it was pointed out, sometimes the rally on Bitcoin comes a little bit after the halving. We've even seen over a year after the halving. But I think what's different this time is the ETF. So how much of this price increase was from the ETFs, how much is from the halving? No one can truly be sure. We also have had interest rates over 5% now, so it's sort of a one-of-a-kind situation. But I'm bullish on Bitcoin in the next year or so from both regulatory things like MiCA in the EU providing certainty to more use cases and technological adoption of the blockchain.
So where do you think Bitcoin could head, Ben, if you're feeling like maybe the reaction will come a little bit later? You seem bullish on Bitcoin. 100,000 more? What are we looking at here?
I'm not a fortune teller, but I do believe in my heart that it will be over 100,000 by the beginning of 2025, especially if the Federal Reserve comes down on interest rates. But again, it's going to need to have more technological adoption. But I think this time, where some of the previous bull runs have been retail focused, we're seeing some of the smartest institutions, including institutions where their leaders said negative things about Bitcoin, have changed their position. So I think that we're going to probably see over $100,000 Bitcoin by the beginning of 2025.
And so much of this is about the miners, the halving. It's not necessarily about Bitcoin itself, but the miners. In fact, miners have raked in abnormal transaction fees. There was a lot of action ahead of the halving. Total miner revenue triple the pre-halving level. Maybe we should be watching some of those names.
Absolutely.
Do you watch those names closely?
We don't watch equities at CoinDesk Indices, but we're certainly aware of the fact that a lot of really interesting and important level 2 activity, what can be built on top of Bitcoin, took place and was exemplified by the transaction fees that accompanied the block at the halving. So that was a record amount of transaction fees. As the miners received less and less rewards from mining Bitcoin, they have to subsidize that with transaction fees. So the more uses for Bitcoin that don't kind of disturb its natural purpose, that leads to more Bitcoin and dollars into miners' pockets and helps sustain that as a business model. Certainly, the expectation is that miners will remain competitive, that hash rates will continue to increase, and the future looks pretty bright. On the macro front, I agree with Ben's comments that interest rate and inflation sensitivity are key. Bitcoin was up like 65, 66% in the first quarter of this year. just like it was last year, but last year was for very different reasons. We were pre-regulatory approval, we were coming down in interest rates, we were coming down in inflation expectations. Now it's the opposite. We have ETFs approved, we have $53 billion in them in the United States, but now it's back to a macro picture. So Bitcoin watchers should pay attention to macro, pay attention to the Fed, especially over the summer. Our trend indicator points neutral, which for now indicates that there's really the upward trend in Bitcoin prices has kind of paused for a minute, but just hang on.
Yeah, understood. And so you have all these ETFs, and now the question is whether or not an Ethereum ETF or ETFs will be approved. I mean, in January when these became they were so popular. Ben, I'll leave it to you. I mean, Bitfarms, Marathon Digital, so many of these other names that we have, Iris Energy, Bit Digital, CleanSpark, just to name some of these miners. But the final thoughts here, should everybody own some Bitcoin or Bitcoin miners or what?
Well, that's a personal decision for everyone. I think if it's between Bitcoin and Bitcoin miners, Bitcoin is the easier thing to buy and probably will be, move with the market more than specialized things like miners. There's always some risk there. But I think another thing we have to look at as well is how is the behavior of consumers who are holding crypto through an ETF different than maybe some of those earlier consumers that got into Bitcoin. If they're maybe more traditional investors who are taking profits more than early enthusiasts of Bitcoin, that could put downward pressure on the price as well in the future.
Yeah, thank you both so much. Ben Weiss, Andy Baehr, great to see you both. Really appreciate it. And Bitcoin is the talk. It's been exciting and now much more ahead. Thanks for joining us here on the Watch List.